Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Florida Supernature. Today's topic is Woodpeckers 101. We're going to have a look at this very interesting family of birds that are very easy to observe and indistinguishable. I'm James Stevenson. I'm with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Extension here in Pinellas County. We provide research-based information for the citizens in our county to help make good decisions in their lives and even help people understand wildlife and the importance of living together with wildlife. Today, we're going to cover worldwide woodpeckers. What makes a woodpecker, woodpecker life, if you will. We'll take a look at some of our local species here in Pinellas County, at least. And finally, we'll end up with how to help, what you could do to become a good woodpecker parent or woodpecker steward, if you will. So we'll go ahead and get on. I need to make one quick disclaimer. If you've been joining us recently, you know that I am in fact a botanist. I am not an ornithologist, but I am a very eager and excited bird watcher in my own life. So here is what a bird looks like perhaps to a botanist. Bird, 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 bird. But I know what it's standing on. It's standing on a certain window. Anyway. With that said, let's crash on and explore this wonderful world of the woodpeckers. Now, this study was done in 2006, and I'm going to share this publication with you. It's not too terribly technical, but it was kind of the first time that a quantitative look at the distribution and densities of different types of woodpeckers as they appear around the world. Having that kind of quantitative data allows scientists to focus on areas that might be under threat, and therefore the species within those areas. It gives us an idea of where the most diversity of woodpeckers can be found. And if you look at this example, the darker colors represent the more densely populated with the most number of different genera within the family of the woodpeckers. So we have a lot of diversity here in South America and even more diversity here in Southeast Asia. You'll notice that woodpeckers are absent from New Zealand, Australia, and New Guinea. They don't particularly like arid deserts like the Sahara or the Arabian or the Gobi, but they can be found here in the desert southwest of the United States. So they're all over the world in various habitats. There are jungle species. This is one from South America, the yellow-throated woodpecker.
There we go.
This lives in a dense, hot, humid, tropical forest. Like I mentioned, we have species here in the desert southwest of the United States. So there are some desert-adapted species. The Gila woodpecker here, and in the absence of trees to peck their wood, these use the larger cacti, and they excavate their holes in the kind of squishy cactus. It's kind of a different way of life from the tropical and the temperate species. They've even adapted to an urban environments. Here we have one of our species, the pileated woodpecker, who's found a home in a telephone pole. So certain woodpecker species have become very adjusted to an urban existence. But most species are considered forest dwellers. They need trees. They have their specially adapted beak that actually can peck into wood, giving them their name. How clever is that? And here in the eastern US, they are entirely found in forests. And this is our most prevalent or easiest seen, the red-bellied woodpecker, taken by one of our friends and volunteers, nictarphotography.com. The largest woodpecker, we always get these kind of questions when we're introducing a group of animals. What's the biggest, what's the smallest, what's the heaviest, what's the most deadly, all these kind of things. So we'll entertain that. The largest is believed to have been the imperial woodpecker, 22 to almost 24 inches. That means If this species was standing next to you while you're watching today, if you're sitting in a chair, he could put his little woodpecker chin right on your lap and you could pet him on the head. That's how big the imperial woodpecker was. It is now believed to be extinct. The second largest, the ivory-billed, which you might have heard of, also believed to be extinct. Certainly, if there are a few individuals left, there's not enough for an outbreeding population. So those are were our largest woodpeckers. Currently holding the record is a southwestern Asian species, the great slaty woodpecker. And this one is not threatened. Its numbers are not in decline. So this is the largest currently, if you will, available woodpecker species. The smallest, there's a group of woodpeckers that are referred to as the piculets, which means little woodpeckers. This is about the size of a wren, so a tiny little thing. Central and South America is their distribution. There's also a few species found in Asia as well. We don't have any of these dear things here in the eastern United States, but it might be worth going to visit them in their home country. So what makes a woodpecker a woodpecker? It's the way they're put together. Morphology is the word that scientists use to refer to how an organism is put together. It's morphology. And morphology is at the very, very base of how scientists create nice little packages, if you will, or circumscriptions, as we call them, of different animal and plant families. They are described by the way they're put together. So if you think of the family of organisms that are known as the whales, you can see how they're put together the same, and then they're speciated. So it's the same with the woodpeckers. They have certain characteristics that occur across the entire family. Their habit of pecking at wood and other surfaces requires a chisel-like beak. So it's kind of flattened on either side like a chisel. So it won't, if a pointed beak would get stuck in the wood. So it's got a flattened chisel-like beak. It is zygodactyl. That's the $5 word of today. Write this one down. It's fun to use it at a party. Zygodactyl. Most birds have 3 toes facing forward and 1 facing back. Imagine, if you can, a turkey footprint or a chicken footprint with those 3 forward-facing toes and 1 facing the reverse. Woodpeckers are zygodactyl, and that means they've got 2 forward-facing and 2 rear-facing toes. And this gives them a good purchase on tree bark, this vertical surface that woodpeckers navigate throughout their lives. And you can probably see his 2 big front toes, maybe his 2 hind, no, I think this is actually a hind toe that's a little bit thrust forward. But anyway, that's what zygodactyl means, 2 forward and 2 reverse. And they have these very stiff, bracing tail feathers that helps, again, with their sharp claws and that zygodactylic foot. That really helps this animal cling to that surface. And the larger the bird, the more curved these very, very stiff mane to tail feathers would be. Again, adding extra strength. Other characteristics of the family, what do they eat? Well, they'll eat anything, really. They are designed, as it were, to feed on insects. That's their primary source of nutrition, but they will eat anything. They will eat fruit. They will eat other plant parts, nuts and seeds, depending on the time of the year and availability of the food source. Some people might notice that woodpeckers will come in the winter to bird feeders. A lot of people put a special kind of bird feed out in winters called suet. That's a fat with seeds in it. And these, what are these? Woodpeckers tend to really like that, that suet. They're cavity nesters, which means that they don't build a stick nest and sit on it. They actually go into a cavity to raise their families. They're also cavity roosters, which means they go to sleep at night in a cavity in a tree. And some species will actually create cavities just for roosting and not for nesting. They have a swoopy flight. They'll glide and dip and then raise up and then glide and dip again on powerful wing beats. Might also want to mention here, this is the red-headed woodpecker. Their coloration in general across the family are these bold black, white, and red markings. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. More about, generally speaking, the woodpeckers. They're constantly wrapping their head against a hard substrate. They're constantly kind of banging their brains out, as it were. And it's said that they get headaches, but that's not true. Of course, that wouldn't be true. Of course, this animal is perfectly specialized for this kind of lifestyle, this kind of foraging technique of pecking and breaking away bits of wood. They have a very smooth brain, so there's not a lot to bump into each other. They have very little cerebrospinal fluid, another $5 3 words for the day. And they have this crazy hyoid bone. Now we have one too. It's called our neck bone, and vertebrates have this structure called the neck bone, but it is incredibly exaggerated in woodpeckers, and it wraps up over the front of the skull, between the skull and the skin, and it acts kind of like a seatbelt that keeps everything in place. It also, because it is referred to as the neck bone, it allows the tongue, the tongue bone, I should have been saying, it allows the tongue to retract up and around the animal's eyeball so that it can stick it way, way out in search of its prey. So those are some adaptations that allow the woodpecker to have this very specialized foraging system. Now, why do they peck? Again, it's foraging. They're looking for food. They break away bits of tree bark, and they're looking for the insects that might be inside. Oftentimes, obviously, termites might be found in dead wood. Ants like to get up inside of trees, and especially the carpenter ants that can actually chew away at wood. There are grubs that find their way in. Woodpeckers can actually do quite a lot of help to trees in that they eat a lot of wood-boring beetles that could do harm to the tree. They also peck to create those cavities, those roosting cavities and nesting cavities. So they create their home, if you will, by pecking away at wood. Now, why do they drum? That's slightly different. If you've heard a woodpecker kind of making that rat-a-tat-tat, that very fast and rapid drumming is what it's technically called. That is an assertion of territory. A woodpecker will find a nice resonant, even better, resonant piece of wood, a hollow log, a gutter, a downspout, something man-made, something that's going to make a nice lot of noise, and they will drum to announce their territory, and they will also drum to announce their willingness and readiness to become betrothed to another woodpecker. And both males and females take part in this drumming. Also, both males and females take part in the excavation of the roosting and of the nesting structures, the nesting holes and cavities is the word I'm looking for. Here's that crazy tongue and how it fits inside the head. They have woodpeckers, because they're trying to lick up insects that are living in the bark of trees. They might have a very sticky tongue that, like an anteater, the insects will simply stick to. They might have a barbed tongue, as in this illustration here. You can actually see these backward-facing barbs that can help. It's like a tool that can extract the insects from whatever it is that they're pecking at. There's a species called the sapsucker, which has a brushy tongue because it laps up sap, the nice, sweet sap that's oozed out of the trees that they create tiny little holes in. Depending on the species, the tongue can be up to 4 or 5 inches long. And as mentioned before, when it's extended, can go that far, but you can see again, this hyoid apparatus allows the tongue to be retracted and get nice and far out of the way. So that's how that works. Breeding, again, these are cavity nesters. So they excavate a cavity to lay their eggs in, provide a nice little base of about an inch or so of wood chips that of course would have been the byproduct of creating this cavity. The eggs are laid directly on that. Both male and female will incubate, will brood, will sit on the eggs. Usually the male will sit overnight in most species and the female during the day. And once the 4 to 6 fledglings have successfully left the cavity and they're fully feathered by the time they leave. So here we have a couple of male pileated woodpeckers getting ready to fledge. They're fully feathered so that they can, when they leave the cavity, they're able to fly upon leaving the nest. And the parents might split the brood up. So the male might take 1 or 2 of the offspring and teach and help them forage for food, and the female might take the other. Most woodpecker species are monogamous. That means they only have 1 pair bond during the year, and most species have long pair bonding periods. So it might go years and years and years and years in the same territory. So monogamous and territorial are characteristics of this family of birds as well. There's all kind of ways to be birds, and there's all kind of mating rituals and these sorts of things. But for the woodpeckers, it's pretty straightforward. 1 mate, 1 territory, year after year. They only have 1 brood per year. If something were to happen early in the season and they were to lose their nest or their eggs, they could try again, but they will create a new nest cavity each time for each set of eggs. They do not reuse their nest cavities. However, the cavities that woodpeckers produce can be and are used by other species of birds who might be cavity nesters, squirrels, flying squirrels, other rodents and snakes. All kinds of things can take advantage of the work of the woodpeckers. How long do they live? This is another, like, one of these little kid questions. How old do they get? Well, it's a big family and there's a lot of variation, but generally speaking, as a whole, between 4 to a dozen years. Larger woodpeckers like the pileated seen here, another photo by one of our wonderful volunteers and friends, Brian. The larger birds live longer, generally speaking. Those birds in more northerly latitudes that have colder winters tend to be even larger. So pileated woodpeckers here in Florida might be smaller than the ones that you would find up in Canada, say, and those birds are going to be larger and they might be able to live longer as well. The threats, there aren't many. And interestingly, in researching this, as a botanist researching woodpeckers, among the different families of birds in the world, the woodpeckers have the fewest endangered members. There aren't that many threats because they are so adaptable, because they tend to live in forests. And although we are definitely losing forests at an alarming rate, this family of birds is able to take advantage of a wide range of forest situations. Now, the few that are endangered, and we do have one right here in Florida, the red cockaded, has a very, very specific forest type that it depends on. And that forest type is vanishing rapidly. And so is that species of woodpecker. And there are a couple of other examples. Other threats, primarily, sadly, collisions with buildings. Although many species have adapted to live in urban areas, they have not adapted to that invisible force field known as glass, and collisions claim the lives of thousands and thousands of birds every year. Other threats could be outdoor cats, although this is an arboreal species. This is an arboreal family, which means they spend the majority of their time in trees. There are a few that might occasionally go to ground in search of food, and that could put them at risk of being attacked by a cat that's outside and not being kept nice and safe inside. let's move on to something nice, like the color of these birds. As mentioned before, generally speaking, it's bold patterning of black, white, and red. Occasionally some yellow thrown in here and there. Our wonderful co-host today, Julia, had this drama unfold in her yard. We'll discuss that a little bit later. But this is a flicker. This is a woodpecker that's referred to as a flicker, a yellow shafted flicker, and you can see how it gets its name in flight. You can see the bright yellow color on the underside of the flight feathers and the underside of the tail feathers. And you can see that these are those very, very stiff bracing tail feathers. They have these very stiff points toward the end as well that helps brace it against the tree. So not a huge range of colors to work from in this family, but certainly the different species wear them well. All right, next we'll talk about the voice, and I'm going to leave this slide up again because, as I mentioned, this is a woodpecker that's referred to as a flicker. Woodpeckers don't have a song. They don't advertise their territory by singing about it. They don't advertise their availability, if you will, by singing about it. Remember how they announce their territory and their availability? The drumming, right. They have that, they use their hard heads and chisel-like beaks to their advantage there. They do have noises, though. They do make various calls, not songs, but calls to announce, again, territory, availability. So during mating season, they will exchange calls between one another. The flicker is called a flicker because one of its calls sounds like that word being repeated over and over, which I am not going to perform for you. You'll have to do it yourself. The family is vast, and we saw the distribution worldwide. Here's a breakdown of the family. The family is known as Pickidae. What we're not going to do today is go through each one of these different genera and talk about them. That would be Snoretown. What we'll look at are the members that are right here in Pinellas County. I can tell you, though, throughout this family, the Pickidae, from the little piculets, those little tiny little wren-sized ones, to the giant slaty, no existent woodpecker or extinct woodpecker ever has or will wear gloves like this one. So that is an inaccuracy. Here in Pinellas, we've got of that whole huge family broken down into subfamilies and the different tribes. You see the different tribes and the subfamilies. So all this classification and organization. We've got these 4 representatives and 5 species. So we've got 2 members of the Pecking tribe and 4 members of the Pecking tribe here in town. Another one of our friends providing us some photographs taken here at Brooker. Thank you, Marcelo. So within the Pecking tribe, we've got the pileated woodpecker and the flicker, which we met before. So those are 2 that are more closely related to each other within the big umbrella group known as the woodpeckers. And then Melanurpini, we've got the sapsucker. This one is not referred to as a woodpecker. It's referred to as a sapsucker because of its feeding habits. In the genus Melanurpes, we don't have red-headed woodpeckers here in Pinellas County. Sadly, there's not the right habitat for them, although people will swear up and down that they've seen red-headed woodpeckers. What it's much more likely that they had seen is another member of the same genus, Melanurpes, the red-bellied woodpecker. But you can't see the red belly on the red-bellied woodpecker, but you can see a red head. So many people refer to this animal as a red-headed, and technically it is a red-headed woodpecker, but it is not the red-headed woodpecker. And finally, the downy woodpecker. And the downy woodpecker is the most widespread woodpecker of all of these in the United States. This one's everywhere, everywhere. And this is our smallest North American woodpecker. So here in Pinellas, we've got the largest, who we have right here, the pileated, and we also have the smallest seen here, the little downy woodpecker. Now, it might be worth mentioning, we have these names like the red-headed or the red-bellied red-bellied woodpecker, the downy woodpecker. There's one called a hairy woodpecker. There's one called a red-cockaded woodpecker, which I mentioned before. All these common names are based on specimens that were examined when they were dead. So their names, unfortunately, don't always give you good field markings, because a downy woodpecker doesn't look downy unless you take it apart, which you can't do, we don't recommend you doing in the field. The hairy woodpecker doesn't look hairy. The red cockaded woodpecker, you have to search for the red cockade on its head. It's got like 3 or 4 little feathers on each side of its head. That's the cockade. So anyway, a lot of these common names were applied based on the findings of specimens that were preserved. Let's talk about some nice things again, shall we? We'll start looking at some of our local species. The big old pileated woodpecker. This is, as mentioned before, our largest. Woodpeckers generally have similar coloration between the sexes. It is possible to tell the difference between males and females if that's important to you in most woodpecker species. In other species, it's down to things like the length of the tongue, which again, you cannot really use in the field. However, if you observe over a very long period of time an individual and where it's feeding, the females with the shorter tongue, as is in the case of the downy woodpecker, is going to feed lower in the branches for different food. And the male with the longer tongue is going to have a slightly different feeding mechanism and habit, feeding higher in the tree. So that way they're not competing for exactly the same resources. Does that make sense? So they can live in the same forest. Remember, they have a territory, and they've got their resources partitioned. So the male is going to be finding his resources up high. The female is going to be finding her resources down low. So they're not looking for exactly the same grubs. In the case of the pileated woodpecker, there is a way to tell the male and the female. Here we have a female. She's got the red crest, just like the male. That's not the crest. You know, bright black back, nice and big size. But right here in the corner of her mouth is a black stripe. It might be easier if we saw a male. A male has a mustache. That could be easy enough to remember in this species and a couple others. So in the case of the pileated woodpecker, the male is going to have a red mustache that runs right down the corner of his mouth. The pileated woodpeckers, they excavate for, as I mentioned before, these ants, these specialized ants that specialize in boring through wood. And so the pileated woodpecker can chip away bark and use its long tongue, sticky and barbed tongue to harvest carpenter ants. And it's been studied 60% of their diet consists of carpenter ants during most of the year when the ants are readily available. As mentioned before, they make new cavities every year. Other animals will then use the cavities that they excavate. Of course, the pileated, being the largest, is going to create the largest cavities that's going to accommodate larger animals such as squirrels, flying squirrels, screech owls, that sort of thing. And the pileated, the populations, although took an initial dive once humans started wrecking their forests, they're becoming more adapted to urban areas. And these, even in my lifetime, which granted is long, I didn't see pileated woodpeckers when I was a little kid growing up in Clearwater. That would have been amazing. But now you can find these really large birds beginning to move into our urban parks and even neighborhoods, as long as they're not pestered, as long as they're left alone. Again, we can see a comparison, the female on the left and the male on the right. Again, those nice, good shot of those nice bracing, stiff tail feathers and those very long claws that allow them to take a grip on that vertical surface. Another member of this tribe within the family of the woodpeckers is the bird that we referred to earlier, the flicker, who got his name from the call that it makes, the northern flicker. And I like this picture from the Fish and Wildlife because it shows the northern flicker on the ground. And flicker is one of a few woodpeckers that actually participate in a feeding habit that's called anting. Ant-ing. They'll go on the ground and they'll peck at anthills and they'll pick ants up off the ground. So here's an example of a woodpecker that spends a certain amount of time on the ground. You'll often see this kind of not very woodpeckery looking bird, but clearly related with that heavy beak. It's going to have all the other structural morphology, those stiff tail feathers and so on. You might find these on the ground looking for ants. They're also slightly sexually dimorphic. And again, it's the mustache. The male has the mustache right from the corner of his mouth. Whereas the female, and here this gives you a good idea of the size of these birds, probably the size of a pigeon. This is a female, so she does not have that, that mustache stripe down the side. Nice bold pattern patch on the front. And here you can see on the female, she's just showing those yellow shafts on the tail feathers and the wing feathers. There's another flicker called a red-shafted flicker. Guess what color the feathers are in that one? So here we have, and I promised you the drama that unfolded in our Julia's backyard. Here we have a flicker. I believe this cavity already existed, and the flicker's kind of checking it out. And one of the threats to woodpeckers, which I failed to mention before, but I'll bring it up now because here's what's happening. The flicker is hanging around, checking out this cavity, goes in the cavity, and apparently there was a huge dust up in the cavity, all this noise and commotion. And poor flicker came out looking a little haggard and eventually flew off. What was inside that cavity was the non-native European starling. And starlings were introduced probably in the turn of the last century as one of Shakespeare's birds, one of the birds mentioned in Shakespeare. And they have established themselves, they're cavity nesters, and they compete. They compete with woodpeckers. They will oust woodpeckers from the cavities that they create. There's a couple of different scenarios that could have been going on here. It's entirely possible that the flicker might have been going in search of the starling's eggs or young. So it's not Snow White out there. Moving on. We've got the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And again, this is one that isn't called a woodpecker, but it belongs in the family because of the morphological characteristics. It does peck at wood, but it does something quite particular to the sapsuckers. It's a good time to mention, most woodpeckers are not migratory. They hang out year-round. They might shift a little bit north or a little bit south, but nothing compares to the yellow-bellied sapsucker in North America. The map, the little inset map here, shows where they breed way up north and then where they spend their winters all the way down into Central America. So that's quite a flight. And we do get sapsuckers here, obviously in Florida during the wintertime. And we've observed them here at Brooker Creek. And they have this very interesting feeding syndrome where they use their little chisels to make these very regular chips out of branches and trunks of trees. They will feed on the plant tissue just under the surface, but these are referred to as sap wells. So eventually the plant is going to react to this injury by sending sap, or sometimes the sap is just leaking. And sap, of course, would contain all those wonderful sugars and carbohydrates that plants are pros at producing. It's their job to take sunlight and air and make sugar, right? So the sugars collect. The sapsuckers have the brush-like tongue that they use to lap that sap, thus the name sapsucker. But also insects would be attracted to that sap as well. Just think, it's like free nectar. The insects are attracted to the sapsuckers can eat those insects as well. So they will return to the same wells, sap wells, year after year. And we actually had a pair here at Brooker that we observed for several seasons. And then sadly, the maple tree where they had excavated all their sap wells fell over. And I'm sure they're still here somewhere on 9,000 acres, but not quite sure where. This is another example. I'll just back up a few. What struck me when I first met the sapsucker here at Brooker was this red patch on the chin of the male that really stuck out and helped identify. I took that note. I'm going to find out what I could tell. It was a woodpecker with all these woodpeckery kind of characteristics, but I wasn't quite sure what. But that chin is what helped me identify the female. That red chin spot is absent. So those are the sapsuckers. Here's the one I said we weren't going to talk about because we don't have it here. The red-headed woodpecker. I just want you to appreciate how different this looks from any of our resident woodpeckers here in Pinellas County. Very well named, this one, right? I mean, its entire head has been dipped in bright red paint. These are found often in farm country. They're arboreal, they need their trees, but they also like open spaces. So they like to swoop down and pick insects out of the air. They do require big old dead trees to nest in. So like the cockaded woodpecker, they have kind of specific needs. And if those needs aren't available, their numbers can decline. And we are seeing that happen as we develop more and more. Fewer and fewer dead trees are left behind. I mean, it's not really our North American, Southeastern North American nature. We're not kind of compelled to leave great big giant dead trees. People might see them as non-aesthetic, something like that. But the red-headed woodpecker needs those to nest in. This and a couple other species will actually collect nuts and acorns, and they'll use their beak to pound them into tree crevices, creating a larder or a granary is how it's referred to, even though it's mostly nuts, so that they can feed on these through the winter. Now, sadly, another threat to the red-headed woodpecker is that they tend to fly rather low. They'll do a sortie to grab an insect in flight, but they'll do kind of a low swoop, kind of around the height of a speeding car. And there's quite a lot of documented impacts with cars. So that's a sad thing. So now we need to talk about something good, right? The hilarious red-bellied woodpecker. And I like this shot from the Fish and Wildlife because it actually shows you the red belly of the red-bellied woodpecker. And it's not even that red. So not the best common name, but here we have it. Another species of melanerpes, just like the red-headed woodpecker. This is the one that you're going to see the most. Even though the downy is the most widespread, the the woodpecker that you're most likely to notice, I should put it that way, is this red-bellied woodpecker here in Pinellas County. It's perfectly suited to suburban, urban parks, very active. It's, again, about the size of a pigeon, so it's not that hard to miss. I like this one, has kind of a mellow lifestyle. It does not do all that much pecking around. It just kind of hangs out and takes things off the surface of the bark. You know, it looks for the caterpillars, doesn't worry too much about pecking too often. It'll even use a nest box, whereas other woodpeckers, you know, wouldn't be caught dead because their whole job is to create, you know, cavities in trees. But the kind of mellow red belly, it's like, oh, okay, here's a cavity that's already happened. I'll go in there. And it also can create and will create a larder, this larder or granary of nuts. It can collect acorns and nuts at the end of the year, even fruits, even insects. It'll even stick a big fat grasshopper in a crevice and snack on that later. So has the ability to overwinter that way. The red bellies have also been observed eating a wider variety of food than many of the others that specialize in insects. Red bellies have been observed eating small fish, have been eating tree frogs, just like anything that moves. If I don't have to work too hard, I'm gonna eat it. That's our red belly. And here we have kind of a montage from our friend Marcelo. And you can see, this is all here at Brooker. You can see this one has got an acorn. It's either gonna eat it right now, or it's gonna go and put it in a crevice in a tree to eat on later. Here we have an itchy red-bellied, and it's scratching its little nose. Here, a nice shot of that bright red stripe down the back of the head that give people the impression that this would be called a red-headed woodpecker. The males and females are slightly different. The male has the red all the way from the nape to the nose, whereas the female just has a little abbreviated patch towards the back of the head. So if it's important to you, you can tell the difference between the male and the female red-bellied sapsucker. Is everybody doing okay? Are y'all all right? I didn't think this was going to take quite so long, so apologies. We'll finish up with the downy woodpecker. Little tiny downy, our smallest. Again, this wonderful shot showing the black and the white, bright white breast. Important to note that I'll show you in a couple of slides, and often visible the little bit of red on the crown just there. Again, as we mentioned, this is the smallest North American woodpecker. It's everywhere except the desert Southwest. And during the winter, we often have what's referred to as a mixed flock. You might see a mixed flock of small birds moving through an area altogether, kind of cleaning the area out of seeds and caterpillars and insects and that sort of thing. The downy woodpecker will join in those intraspecific groups, working together, eating different things, foraging different ways, but hanging out together. The downy woodpecker, being so small, can be mistaken for a little songbird called the black and white warbler. But the black and white warbler has, even though it clings to it has a very similar feeding habit, clinging to the bark and pecking for insects. This one is much more likely to face down and sideways and run around in circles, whereas generally speaking, the woodpeckers remain pretty much upright during their foraging and pecking. I mean, they use gravity as well as the physics of pecking into a surface don't quite work when you're upside down, or don't work as well, I should say. So a looky-like might be the black and white warbler, which does not have this bright, bold chest. And the warbler is smaller than the downy woodpecker as well. And the warbler does not slam its face into wood either. It just doesn't. So what do you do? How do you help Now, as I mentioned, the woodpeckers aren't, generally speaking, under as much threat as many other bird families, but still it's worth protecting what we have by being good stewards of the land that we have purview over. If you have a dead tree in the yard, if it's not threatening to land on your house, leave it. Leave it to fill up with termites. Leave it to fill up with grubs and carpenter ants. Just think of all the different species. Leave it to fill up with fungus, all the different things that can take advantage of a dead tree. It is said that a dead tree sustains more life than a living tree because of the all the different organisms, bacteria, fungus, so on, insects, birds, whatever, that can use. If you do have a tree that is dead and is posing a threat to your house, consider maybe not taking the whole thing out and just leave perhaps a 10 or an 8 or a 10 or a 12-foot stand of that tree trunk. Again, until it completely rots away and the birds have had at it, consider that as habitat. Tolerate pests. Your pest is woodpecker food. So think of it that way. Maybe lay off on the yard care a little bit. Maybe all those caterpillars aren't such a bad thing. Give a thought to the fact of what we call pests are usually something else's food. Nest boxes, again, with the exception of the red-bellied, nest boxes are kind of, you know, not the woodpecker's thing, because they're kind of born to bore, as it were. So nest boxes, you can try it, sure. You might get screech owls move in, you might get red-bellied move in. Oftentimes bees find nest boxes, so you need to be cognizant of that. But with all bird watching, bird feeding, your woodpeckers will come during the winter for seeds when, you know, other resources might be limited. So that's a way. Provide fresh, clean water, as with other attracting birds to your backyard, clean being the operative word there. And most importantly, if you've learned anything today at all, please educate others on this group of birds, that we have such a nice but approachable diversity. We have a handful of different woodpeckers, not an overwhelming number of different kinds of woodpeckers. With a little bit of practice, you can learn to identify and learn the behaviors and the natural history of our few species that we have here in our part of Florida. So, again, I'm James Stevenson with the University of Florida IFAS Extension here in Pinellas County. I'm so glad you joined us this afternoon. And I'll say goodbye for now. And thank you very much for tuning in. If you have any questions, any comments, complaints, concerns, ideas for future programming, we'd love to hear from you. You can use my email address here, my UF email address, or my county email address, my first initial last name at Pinellas County. Next week is Spice Science, June 10th, Wednesday at 2 o'clock. We hope to see you there. So thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you next time.